Do you remember Abu Ghraib? That was the torture prison that the U.S. established in Iraq about 20 years ago. Now, the prison was staffed with contractors and the U.S. military. The contractors was a company whose initials are CACI. I always thought it was interesting that it was, you could pronounce that CACI. But CACI was the outside contractor that decided a lot of the different torture methods, and then those methods were applied by U.S. military. You remember the notorious photographs. People standing with electrodes attached to their thumbs or their genitals, stacks of naked men. To Muslim men, being naked like that is just an outrage for them to try to have to deal with. But the U.S. military under George Bush and Dick Cheney, and who was the Secretary of Defense then, that miserable son of a bitch, boy, how quick we forget. But there was no attention paid to cultural differences or requirements or what was culturally painful to people when we invaded Iraq. We went in there because George Bush wanted us to go in there and killed probably 1 million Iraqis. Now, I'm not going to get into a whataboutism here between Gaza and Iraq, but the fact remains that the United States, and I've said this before, has been involved in more war crimes in the past 75 years than Israel could ever hope to be involved in. That's just the way it is. I'm sorry. That's just the way, and I am sorry, but that's just the way it is. Anyway, there was a trial of the military contractor, CACI, that was accused of contributing to the abuse and the torture and the suffering of detainees at the Abu Ghraib Prison in Iraq 20 years ago. I finally went to trial. And a judge declared a mistrial this past Thursday after the jury said it was deadlocked and couldn't reach a verdict. The announcement of the mistrial came on the 8th day of deliberations in that trial. And the truth is, the deliberations themselves went far longer than the trial did. But anyway, it was an 8-member civil jury in Alexandria, Virginia. And it wound up deadlocked on the accusations that these civilian interrogators who were supplied to the Army at Abu Ghraib in 2003 and 2004, that they had conspired with soldiers there to abuse detainees as a means of, do you remember this phrase? Softening them up for questioning by the CIA, by CID, by the various acronyms of various departments of the U.S. military that you and I will really never know anything about. But this company, based in Reston, Virginia, CACI, C-A-C-I, had argued in the trial that, hey, wait, whoa, we're not complicit in the detainees' abuse. In the trial, they said that its employees of this contracting outfit had minimal interactions with the 3 plaintiffs in the case. And that any liability for the mistreatment of those 3 men belonged to the U.S. government, not CACI. So, I mean, it was up for the jury to decide, and the jury couldn't decide. The multiple jurors told the Associated Press after this thing was declared a mistrial that a majority of the jury sided with the plaintiffs. But the people who spoke to the AP wouldn't give an exact number of the number of people on that 8-member panel who were for the plaintiffs who brought the case and those who were against it. But they said the majority. So what would have been 6-2, 7-1, 5-3? Who knows? The jury sent out a note on Wednesday last saying it was deadlocked. And in the note, the jury indicated that it was hung up on a legal principle known as borrowed servants doctrine. You know, one thing in the age of Trump and the age of these trials that are coming out now, 20 years after the fact, aren't we just learning so much about the inner workings of the legal system in this country? Or should I say the inner non-workings of the legal system in this country? Take your pick. Now, CACI, as one of its defenses in this trial, argued that it shouldn't be liable for any torture or trouble or violations of human rights by its employees because the employees were under the control and direction of the United States Army. How's that for a defense? You know, it's like saying, yeah, okay, all right, yeah, we did torture them. We did attach electrodes to their genitals. We did have piles of screaming Muslim men photographed in horrible situations. But hey, wait a minute. Yeah, we did it, but we were under control of the U.S. Army. Isn't that great? Now, the lawyers for the three people who were tortured and humiliated, the lawyers tried to bar CACI from making that particular argument during the trial, that they couldn't be held responsible because they were employed by the U.S. military, right? But the judge in the case allowed that argument to be entered as part of their defense. The judge who accepted the idea of a mistrial. Both sides in this trial had argued about the scope of that doctrine, that so-called borrowed servants doctrine. And bottom line, though, it was CACI, if CACI could prove its interrogators were under the command and control of the Army at the time these crimes occurred, then the jury was instructed to find in favor of the defendant, CACI. Well, that didn't happen, but it cast enough doubt into deliberations by the jury where they wound up a hung jury. The issue of who controlled CACI interrogators apparently was a significant portion of the trial itself. And the officials for CACI, of course, testified that they basically turned over supervision of the interrogators to the Army. I mean, what a bullshit thing to say. Hey, these people work for us. Yeah, the interrogators, my ass. Yeah, they work for us, but, they were working for the Army. We turned over control to the U.S. Army. We don't have anything to do with this. Right. Now, lawyers for the plaintiffs in this case argued just the opposite, and the lawyers introduced evidence, including CACI's contract with the Army, which required CACI to supervise its own employees. It was right there in the contract. But this is the age of Trump. This is the age of American fascism coming out of its cocoon. Nothing that anybody says who are charged with these kinds of crimes, whether it's Trump or CACI or whoever it is ever going to tell the truth. It's going to be lie, obfuscate, bullshit, convince at least one juror on the jury to vote against a guilty plea, no matter what the charge is. This is what Trump's lawyers are aiming for right now in the trial that's in effect right now. Just one. That's all you need, is just one. Because these are criminal trials. So jurors also, in this trial, jurors saw a section of the Army field manual that pertains to contractors that are hired by the Army. And that section states, quote, only contractors may supervise and give direction to their employees, end quote. So for CACI to say, hey, look, it's the Army. We turned over authority to the Army. Not only is that a goddamn lie and bullshit and just the usual garbage you expect from military contractors who are in a position like this, the torturers. I mean, what do you expect? Not only is it a lie, but the Army knew it was a lie. And so did CACI. So anyway, what came out from the jury when they were trying to explain why they were deadlocked, they sent a note out that said, trying to explain their deadlock, and the jury said that the field manual, the Army field manual, was one of the pieces of evidence over which the jury members disagreed. How can you disagree when the Army field member says, quote, only contractors may supervise and give direction to their employees, end quote. It's just like paragraph 3 of the 14th Amendment says that anybody who has held office and doesn't hold political office now, who tried, aided, or abetted to overthrow the U.S. government cannot run again. But our filthy U.S. Supreme Court said, nah, you can't do that. No, sorry, Colorado, you're not going to dictate to the rest of the country who can and cannot be candidates for the office of the presidency, right? And I might add that decision was unanimous. So the plaintiffs in this case, the men who were tortured and humiliated and brutalized and had their dignity taken away from them, they say, well, they haven't said this yet, but whether they're going to or not, but they can seek a retrial. Asked if they would do so, if they're going to seek a retrial, one of their lawyers, a guy with the Center for Constitutional Rights, said that, quote, the current expectation is that we'll continue to fight. And this guy added, quote, the work we put into this case is a fraction of what they endured as survivors of the horrors of Abu Ghraib. And we want to honor their courage, end quote. Now, this is one of the terrible things about this. It's been 20 years. We Americans have a hard time remembering what happened last week. But I'm sure you remember there were sweatshirts made up that showed that horrible picture of the man standing up on a desk or a table with the hood over his head and what appeared to be like a diaper around his midsection, around his groin, with electrodes attached to his hands. I mean, son of a bitch. And this is when the Office of Legal Counsel in the United States government under Bush came up with a ruling that torture, under the circumstances that were contrived where it concerned Iraq, that torture was okay. Hey, it's okay. So it was during the Bush-Cheney administration that torture became a legal part of our system of extracting confessions from people that we have captured on a so-called battlefield. So many of the prisoners in Abu Ghraib, if you remember this also, so many of the prisoners were civilians. They were cab drivers. They were farmers. They were people who worked with their hands. They were shop owners. But when the U.S. military went in and dismantled the entire country, and look at it now, by the way, Iraq, the U.S. military also decided, well, let's start snatching people off the streets and out of the countryside and bring them in and torture the shit out of them and see if they will tell us what they know about Saddam Hussein. We knew everything there was to know about Saddam Hussein. We financed Saddam Hussein the same way we're financing Netanyahu. Only with Saddam, it was in his battle of attrition against Iran, the Iran-Iraq war. Do you remember that? That war that was in the 90s that went on for, 8 years between those two countries, to the point where both militaries, I believe, were sending, I think Iran was sending boys to fight because they ran out of men. There were any estimate from 500,000 to 2 million fighters between Iran and Iraq who killed each other during that horrible war. And what did the United States do? We were funding and supplying Iraq with intelligence and weaponry and encouragement. Keep going, don't settle, keep it going. The lawsuit was filed in 2008, 5 years after this horror took place. But it was delayed for 15 years by this legal wrangling and bullshit and multiple attempts by CACI to have the case dismissed. We are seeing that in real time with this filthy, rotten Nazi son of a bitch, Donald Trump. Look at the delays with some more than willing judges to grant him these delays, to send it back down to a lower court, to send it back up to a higher court, to put it aside, to put it here, to put it there. Same goddamn thing. Only the war crimes that the Bush administration committed in Iraq are just now starting to go to trial. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. You know, the Progressive Voices Network brings you commercial-free commentary from today's leading progressive radio hosts and pundits, like me, Mike Malloy, 24 hours a day. I'm not your typical old guy from the 80s or the 90s talk radio host, and Progressive Voices is not your typical talk radio network. It's a listener-supported nonprofit with no corporate control whatsoever over our broadcast. So hosts like me, Mike Malloy, are free to rant and scream and carry on about whatever we like. We're often controversial, but we're never boring. Weeknights, 9 p.m. in the East, 6 p.m. in the West on the Progressive Voices Network. Always progressive, always on. I'm Mike Malloy. Keep it lit.